They laughed when the exhaust sputtered, a thick cloud of black diesel smoke coating Bryce Caldwell's pristine leather boots. "You can't farm with that junk, old man," he sneered. 48 hours later, Bryce wasn't laughing. He was begging my grandfather to save his $500,000 fleet from sinking into the earth. The smell of impending rain and burning diesel was a permanent fixture in my childhood, but by the autumn of 2024, it carried the bitter scent of desperation. Oakhaven Valley used to be a patchwork quilt of family-owned plots, where neighbors traded labor and shared the sting of bad harvests. That was before Caldwell AgriCorp rolled into town. My grandfather, Robert Henderson, was 78 years old. His hands looked like cured leather, mapped with the scars of 60 years spent fighting the dirt. He was a man of few words and profound stubbornness, traits perfectly mirrored by the machine he refused to retire, a 1954 John Deere 70 diesel. We called her Old Iron. While other farmers in the valley had mortgaged their futures to buy climate-controlled cabs with GPS, auto-steering, and touchscreen displays, Robert stuck to raw, mechanical torque. "Microchips don't grow corn, Liam," he'd tell me, wiping grease from his brow with a rag that was more oil than cloth. "And they sure as hell don't know how to talk to the mud." But talking to the mud wasn't paying the bills. The bank had been sending envelopes with bold red lettering for 6 months. Crop prices were down, fertilizer costs were astronomical, and a late freeze had decimated our early yields. We were teetering on the edge of foreclosure. Enter Charles Caldwell. Charles was a third-generation businessman who realized that farming was more profitable when run from a boardroom in Chicago than from a tractor seat. He had been systematically buying up struggling farms across the county, consolidating them into a massive, heavily subsidized corporate operation. He didn't employ farmers, he employed heavy machinery technicians. And he had his sights set on the Henderson farm specifically, the 300 acres of prime, nutrient-rich bottomland that connected our property to his ever-expanding empire. The confrontation that sparked the war happened on a Tuesday morning at Jensen's Feed and Seed. Grandpa and I had driven the old flatbed into town for parts. As we walked out, a gleaming matte black Ford F-250 pulled up, blocking our truck. Out stepped Charles Caldwell, wearing a pressed flannel shirt that had clearly never seen a day of actual labor, followed by his 20-something son, Bryce. Bryce was the crown prince of Caldwell AgriCorp. He drove their flagship machines and treated the local independent farmers like medieval peasants. "Robert," Charles said, a slick smile plastered on his face. "Just the man I wanted to see. I was looking over the county plats. I hear Tom at the bank is getting a little impatient with your accounts." Grandpa Robert stopped, a 50-pound sack of feed balanced effortlessly on his shoulder. "My accounts are between me and Tom, Charles. Move your truck." Bryce chuckled, leaning against the polished grill of his Ford. "Come on, old man. Have you seen the forecast? It's going to pour for a week straight. You're not getting your harvest in with that antique junk you have sitting in your barn. Sell to us now. We'll give you a fair price for the land, and maybe we'll even buy that rust bucket John Deere to put in our corporate lobby as a museum piece." Grandpa's jaw tightened. He slowly lowered the feed sack into the bed of our truck. He walked right up to Bryce, not stopping until he was inches away from the younger man's face. "That junk pulled your grandfather's tractor out of a ditch in the spring of '68, Robert said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It's got a cast-iron block and a flywheel heavy enough to crush that plastic toy truck of yours. It runs on compression and fire, not software." Charles stepped in, dropping the smile. "Pride doesn't pay off loans, Robert. There's a new contract up for the Miller tract lease. The bank is managing the estate. 500 acres of the best soil in the state. Condition of the lease is clearing the old western windbreak, those massive oak stumps before the ground freezes. We're taking our new fleet out there tomorrow. When we secure that lease, you'll be completely boxed in. You won't survive another season. Sell now, with dignity." The Miller tract was the holy grail of Oakhaven. It had been tied up in probate for a decade. Whoever got that lease would dominate the valley's agricultural output for the next 20 years. If Caldwell got it, the sheer scale of his operation would drive the local co-op out of business, taking us down with it. "We put a bid in for the Miller lease too, Charles," I spoke up, my heart hammering in my chest. I had forged Grandpa's signature on the application just the day before, a desperate Hail Mary to save the farm. Bryce burst out laughing. "You? With what machinery? We're bringing in 3 brand new Case IH Steiger 620 quad tracks tomorrow. 600 horsepower apiece. Computer-controlled traction. We'll have those stumps ripped out in 12 hours. You'll snap your grandfather's little toy in half trying to pull a single root." Robert didn't blink. He looked at Charles, then at Bryce. "I guess we'll see whose machinery does the talking when the rain hits." The sky bruised a deep, violent purple by Wednesday afternoon. The meteorologists had predicted a standard autumn squall, but anyone who had lived in Oakhaven long enough knew the smell of the air meant a deluge. The Miller Tract sat in a topographical bowl. Its soil was famously rich but notoriously heavy, a dense, clinging clay that turned into an unforgiving, suctioning sludge with the slightest precipitation. The windbreak the bank wanted cleared was a mile-long line of century-old oak stumps, some 10 feet in diameter, left behind when the old Miller patriarch logged the edge of the property in the 90s. They were deeply rooted, anchored into the heavy clay like the teeth of the earth itself. By the time Grandpa and I arrived at the edge of the tract on Thursday morning, the rain had been falling in sheets for 14 hours. The ground was already a treacherous mire. We had driven old iron there in the dark. The 1954 John Deere 70 didn't look like much against the gray morning light. It lacked a cab, exposing the driver to the elements. Its green paint was chipped and faded to a pale olive, and the massive rear tires were caked in mud. But under the hood was a perfectly timed, two-cylinder diesel engine. When Grandpa fired it up, the iconic pop, pop, pop echoed across the valley, a rhythmic heartbeat of pure, unadulterated mechanical power. Parked on the ridge above the tract was the Caldwell fleet. It looked like an alien invasion. 3-case IH Steiger, 620 quad tracks sat idling. They were magnificent, terrifying machines. Bright red, fully enclosed, standing taller than a 2-story house, and resting on massive, 4-point tank tracks instead of wheels. They cost upwards of $600,000 each. Inside the cabs, I could see the glow of an array of touchscreen monitors. Bryce Caldwell was standing under a massive umbrella held by an assistant, shouting into a radio. His father, Charles, sat warm and dry in his truck on the paved county road, watching. Tom Jensen, the bank manager, was there in a bright yellow rain slicker, holding a clipboard inside a plastic bag. He looked miserable. "Robert! Liam!" Tom yelled over the roar of the rain and the idling quad tracks. "The bank's terms are clear. The tract goes to whoever proves they have the capability to clear the stumps and prep the field before the freeze. Caldwell's crew is going first." Bryce smirked at us from under his umbrella. He keyed his radio. "All right, boys. Let's show these hillbillies how modern agriculture works. Hook up to the first stump. Full throttle. Let the computers handle the traction." I watched with a knot in my stomach. A massive high-tensile steel chain was hooked from the drawbar of the lead quad track to a massive oak stump that looked like a jagged tooth. The driver inside the cab, a hired contractor from out of state, gave a thumbs up. The 620 horsepower engine roared, drowning out the thunder. The massive tracks began to churn. For a moment, it was awe-inspiring. The machine lunged forward, the heavy chain snapping taut with a violent crack. The quad track dug in, the computerized sensors instantly calculating slip and adjusting power to the 4 independent tracks. But then, the reality of Oakhaven clay set in. The computer, detecting resistance, sent more torque to the tracks. The tracks spun faster, churning the topsoil. But underneath the slick, wet clay was a hardpan layer. The tracks, designed to float over soft soil, couldn't bite into the hardpan through the liquid mud. Instead of pulling forward, the $600,000 machine began to pull straight down. "More power!" Bryce screamed into his radio. "Override the slip sensors!" "I can't." The driver's voice crackled back over Bryce's radio, loud enough for us to hear. "The ECU is throwing error codes. It thinks we're slipping too much. It's cutting power to the engine to protect the drivetrain. Then bypass it. It's hard-coded into the software. Mr. Caldwell, if I push it, the computer will shut the engine off completely." Bryce cursed and waved the second quad track forward. "Hook them in tandem. Pull it together." The crew scrambled in the mud, hooking a second chain from the front of the stuck quad track to the rear of the second one. Now they had over 1,200 horsepower and 8 massive tracks ready to pull. They throttled up together. The noise was deafening. The earth literally shook beneath our boots. Snop. The sound echoed like a cannon shot. The sheer immense force of the second machine pulling the first machine, which was suctioned deep into the clay, caused the automated hitch on the lead tractor to shear right off. The second tractor lurched forward violently, its tracks spinning wildly out of control before the computer panicked and killed the engine. Silence fell over the field, save for the relentless pounding of the rain. The first quad track was now buried to its axles in mud. Its tracks were utterly useless, encased in thick, glue-like clay. The second machine was dead in the water, its hazard lights flashing, the cab's digital displays glowing bright red with critical software failures. Bryce threw his radio into the mud. Charles Caldwell slowly stepped out of his warm truck, his face pale as he surveyed the disaster. $500,000 of machinery was helplessly trapped in the earth, defeated by a single oak stump and the unforgiving Oak Haven mud. Grandpa Robert watched the spectacle without a change in expression. He calmly reached into his pocket, pulled out a pair of worn leather work gloves and pulled them on. He looked at me, a rare, terrifying glint in his eye. "All right, Liam," Grandpa said quietly, his voice cutting through the rain with chilling clarity. "Go hook Old Iron up." The rain was falling so hard now that it felt like standing under a waterfall. The valley had turned into a slate-gray ocean of misery, and right in the middle of it sat $500,000 of dead, sinking corporate steel. Grandpa Robert didn't walk with the hurried panic of a man caught in a storm. He walked with the measured, deliberate stride of a man who had survived 6 decades of them. I followed him to where Old Iron sat, its faded green paint darkened by the deluge. Bryce Caldwell had abandoned his broken radio and marched over to us, his designer rain jacket plastered to his chest. His face was a mask of furious humiliation. "What do you think you're doing, old man?" Bryce shouted over the thunder, waving a hand toward our 1,954 John Deere 70. "If my dual-rigged quad tracks couldn't break that root system, your rusted-out lawnmower is going to snap its axle in half. Leave it. The bank is going to declare this field unworkable." Grandpa climbed up onto the steel pan seat. He didn't even look at Bryce. He looked down at me. "Liam, fetch the logging chain from the flatbed. Not the tow strap, the heavy drop-forged chain." I nodded and ran through the mud, my boots sinking past the ankles with every step. The earth here wasn't just wet. It was predatory. It sucked at your feet, trying to pull you down. When I returned with the heavy chain draped over my shoulders, Bryce was still yelling, but his father, Charles Caldwell, had walked up behind him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder to quiet him. Charles was watching Grandpa with a nervous, calculating intensity. "Robert," Charles said, his voice stripped of its earlier slick confidence. "Be reasonable. The mud is too deep. The suction is too strong. You're going to get yourself hurt to prove a point that doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to my family," Grandpa said softly, engaging the starter. The 2-cylinder diesel engine fired with a deafening crack-pop, pop-pop. It wasn't the smooth hum of a modern 6-cylinder engine. It was raw, percussive violence. A thick plume of black smoke shot from the vertical exhaust pipe, momentarily cutting through the rain. Grandpa eased the tractor forward, steering with the heavy, unassisted iron wheel. He didn't drive toward the stump that had defeated the Caldwells. He drove toward the largest oak stump in the entire windbreak, a massive, gnarled monster with roots as thick as tree trunks sprawling into the clay. Tom Jensen, the bank manager, wiped his fogged glasses. "Robert, that's the king stump. It goes down 10 feet. Grandpa backed Old Iron up to the massive, jagged wood. "Hook her up, Liam, low on the drawbar. Keep the angle of draft pointing down." I waded into the muck, looping the heavy chain around the base of the stump, securing the hook and dropping the other end onto the tractor's heavy steel drawbar. Here is the secret that boardroom farmers like the Caldwells never understood. Modern tractors are built to float. They use massive wide tracks or incredibly wide dual tires to spread their immense weight over a large surface area so they don't compact the soil. But when topsoil turns to slick liquid clay, floating is the last thing you want. You become a hockey puck on wet ice. Lud. Old Iron was built differently. Its rear tires were exceptionally tall and aggressively narrow. Furthermore, Grandpa had filled the inner tubes with calcium chloride liquid ballast and bolted cast iron wheel weights to the rims. The tractor didn't float. It was designed to sink like a stone through the soft, slick topsoil until those deep rubber lugs found the solid, rocky, hardpan bedrock beneath. "Clear out!" Grandpa yelled. I scrambled back, standing next to a stunned Tom Jensen and a sneering Bryce. Grandpa Robert didn't rev the engine to a scream like the corporate drivers had. He throttled down. He wanted low, slow, unbreakable torque. He engaged the clutch. The chain whipped off the ground, pulling taut with the metallic groan of stressed steel. The tractor stopped moving forward. The massive rear tires began to turn. For a terrifying 3 seconds, they spun in the mud, throwing rooster tails of black clay into the air. Bryce let out a sharp bark of laughter. "See? I told you! Junk!" But Bryce didn't know how to listen to the mud. As the tall, heavily weighted tires spun, they were rapidly excavating the slick clay, digging deep trenches. Suddenly, the pitch of the John Deere's engine changed. It grew deeper, a guttural roar of immense resistance. The tires had reached the hardpan. They had found their bite. The front tires of the tractor slowly lifted off the ground. The machine was rearing up like a wild horse, throwing all of its weight onto the rear axle. The engine bogged down, the pop-pop-pop slowing to a rhythmic, agonizing chug, chug, chug. Every fiber of modern engineering logic dictated that the engine would stall, or a computer would kill the power to save the transmission. But there were no computers here. There was only fire, compression, and a cast iron block that refused to die. Grandpa feathered the clutch, balancing the tractor perfectly on its rear wheels. From deep beneath the earth, a sound echoed over the rain. It sounded like a cannon, firing underground. Crack. The earth around the massive oak stump bulged upward. Crrr snap. With a violent heave, the king stump ripped free from the clay, tearing a hole in the ground the size of a minivan. The sudden release of tension slammed the front wheels of the John Deere back into the mud with a massive splash. Grandpa didn't stop. He dragged the 5-ton stump 20 yards out of the windbreak, leaving a deep furrow in his wake. He idled the engine down, popped it into neutral, and looked over his shoulder at Tom Jensen. "One down," Grandpa yelled over the rain. 40 to go. Does the bank still think this field is unworkable, Tom? Tom Jensen's jaw was practically resting on his chest. He frantically scribbled on his wet clipboard. "No, Robert, I've never seen anything like it." Bryce's face drained of all color. He stared at the massive crater left by the stump, then looked at the ancient green tractor, idling happily in the storm. But the victory was only half of the story, because while we had been focused on the stump, the rain had been doing what rain does best, seeking the lowest point of elevation. And the lowest point of elevation on the Miller tract was exactly where the Caldwells had parked their crippled $600,000 Case IH Quadtracs. Dad, look!" Bryce suddenly screamed, pointing down the slope. The earth where the two massive tractors were stuck had given way entirely. The heavy churning of their tracks had destroyed the structural integrity of the clay bowl. A small flash flood was sweeping down the hillside, pooling directly into the rutted depression where the machines were trapped. The muddy water was rising fast. It was already over the lower tracks of the first machine and creeping up the chassis. "The air intakes!" Bryce yelled, panic finally shattering his arrogant facade. "If the water breaches the intakes or floods the main ECU housing, it's going to hydrolock the engines. They'll be totaled." "Get the service trucks down there," Charles ordered, pulling his phone from his pocket. "We can't," Bryce yelled back. "The service trucks are on highway tires. They won't make it 10 feet off the pavement in this soup." Charles Caldwell stared at his phone. No signal in the storm. He looked at the highway, a mile away. Even if he could call a heavy wrecker, it would take 2 hours to arrive, and no commercial tow truck would risk sinking their own rig in this catastrophic mud pit. By then, the water would destroy $1 million worth of uninsured corporate assets. The insurance investigators would see the bypass safety logs in the computer and deny the claim for gross negligence. Caldwell Agricorp was staring down the barrel of a devastating, unrecoverable loss. Charles's eyes darted around the valley, realizing how utterly isolated his wealth and technology had left him. Finally, his gaze landed on Grandpa Robert, who had climbed down from Old Iron and was quietly wiping the rain from his face with a greasy rag. The corporate titan walked over to the old farmer. Every step Charles took through the mud seemed to strip away a layer of his pride. By the time he reached us, he looked small, defeated. "Robert," Charles said, his voice trembling slightly. He looked at the sinking Quadtracs, then back at my grandfather. "Robert, I need your help, please." Grandpa slowly folded his rag and put it in his pocket. He looked down the hill at the rising water. "Looks like you've got a bit of a moisture problem down there, Charles. Might want to have your computer recalculate the traction." Bryce stormed over, his face flushed red. "This isn't a joke, Henderson. We're losing $1 million down there. Pull us out." Grandpa's eyes hardened. He took a single step toward Bryce, and the younger man instinctively backed away. "I don't take orders from boys who wear clean boots to a mud fight," Grandpa growled. He turned his attention back to Charles. "I can pull them out, but I don't work for free, and I sure as hell don't work for Caldwell Agricorp." "I'll pay you," Charles said desperately, reaching for a soaked checkbook in his breast pocket. $10,000. Cash. Right now. Just hook that chain up." Grandpa shook his head. "I don't want your money, Charles. I want my farm." Charles blinked, the rain pouring off his nose. "What?" "I know why you bid on the Miller tract," Grandpa said, his voice steady and unrelenting. "You wanted to box me in, cut off my access to the county irrigation canal, and force the bank to call in my loans, so you could buy my bottomland for pennies. That ends today." Grandpa gestured to me. I reached inside my heavy waterproof jacket and pulled out a folded manila envelope. I had printed it at the public library the day before, a desperate backup plan I'd hoped we wouldn't need. It was a formal withdrawal of bid. "You're going to sign this," Grandpa said, taking the paper and handing it to Charles. "You formally withdraw your bid for the Miller lease. Furthermore, you sign the addendum stating that Caldwell Agricorp will never attempt a hostile buyout of the Oakhaven Independent Co-op." Bryce gasped. "Dad, you can't. That ruins our entire expansion strategy for the decade." Charles looked at his son, then at the water which had just crested the lower cab doors of his lead tractor. He looked at Tom Jensen, who was standing quietly, serving as a very official, very legal witness to the entire exchange. Charles snatched the pen from Tom's clipboard. With shaking hands, he signed the soaked paper against the hood of my grandfather's truck. "Done," Charles breathed, handing it back. "It's done. Please, Robert, save my fleet." Grandpa carefully handed the contract to me. He nodded. "All right, Liam, let's get to work. Go get the snatch block from the toolbox." A snatch block is a heavy-duty pulley. When you loop a pull cable through it and attach it back to the towing vehicle, it effectively doubles your pulling power by halving the speed. We waded down into the rising water. The cold was biting, seeping through my jeans and freezing my legs. I had to dive under the murky, freezing mud to find the heavy steel tow hooks on the front of the stuck quad track. I locked the snatch block in place, ran a heavy steel cable through it, and attached both ends back to the drawbar of old iron. Grandpa backed the John Deere up the slope to solid, unbroken ground. He didn't have the weight of a 600 horsepower machine, but with the snatch block, he was generating an immense amount of localized mechanical leverage. "Clear!" I screamed, scrambling up the muddy bank. Grandpa engaged the power takeoff (PTO) winch he had mounted on the rear of the tractor years ago. Instead of driving forward and risking slipping, he parked the tractor, locked the heavy brakes, and let the engine power the winch directly. The John Deere roared. The steel cable snapped tight, shedding water like a shaken dog. Wrote. For a terrifying minute, nothing happened. The quad track was vacuum sealed into the mud, but the mechanical winch didn't care about software. It didn't have a sensor to tell it to quit. It just pulled, relentlessly, unforgivingly. Slowly, agonizingly, the mud broke with a loud, sucking skluck. The massive red quad track lurched forward, pulled from the sinkhole by a tractor 1/10 its price and 1/10 of its horsepower. The corporate driver inside steered wildly as Grandpa winched the behemoth up onto the safety of the ridge. We repeated the process for the second tractor, dragging it free, just as the water level reached the air intakes of the engine. By the time the final chain was unhooked, the rain had finally begun to slow to a drizzling mist. The Caldwell crew was exhausted, covered in mud, and utterly humiliated. Charles Caldwell didn't say another word. He simply nodded to my grandfather, climbed into his truck, and drove away. Bryce followed, refusing to make eye contact with either of us. Tom Jensen walked up to Grandpa, looking at the newly signed contract in my hand. "Well, Robert," Tom said, a slight smile breaking through his professional demeanor. "Looks like the Miller tract is yours. I'll have the bank draft the lease paperwork on Monday." Grandpa reached out and patted the cold, wet iron hood of his 1954 John Deere. The engine was ticking softly as the metal cooled in the autumn air. "Take your time, Tom," Grandpa said, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his eyes. "We've got plenty of time, and it looks like we've got some plowing to do." He climbed back onto the steel seat, motioned for me to jump on the axle beside him, and we drove the long way home. We didn't have GPS. We didn't have climate control, and we didn't have a boardroom in Chicago. But as the exhaust puffed a steady, victorious rhythm into the gray sky, we knew one thing for certain. We had the dirt, and we knew how to talk to it. And that's how a 70-year-old piece of iron proved that heart and raw mechanics can still beat a boardroom's budget. If you loved hearing how Grandpa Robert put the corporate giants in their place, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates the classics. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life tales from the Heartland. What would you have done in Robert's boots? Let me know in the comments.